Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In our last episode, we looked at history through the eyes of the Iranian people, a journey marked by deep scars and a sense of betrayal. But looking at only one side of history never gives us the full picture. So today, we're going to make a massive leap in perspective. We're moving away from the streets of Tehran and stepping directly into the strategic situation rooms of the Pentagon in Washington. When people talk about the conflict between the U.S. and Iran, the explanations on social media are usually pretty cheap. It's either a conspiracy theory or it's all about oil. But think about it. The U.S. has been energy independent for years. Why would they continue to spend trillions of dollars and a century of effort on this region? The truth is much colder than you might think. On a grand strategic level, this isn't a simple resource grab. It's a civilizational bomb disposal project. Today, I want to peel back the layers of nationalistic emotion and face a reality most people ignore. If the U.S. had chosen to just sit on the sidelines over the last 100 years, the Middle East today might be a very different place. It could have easily become a region lost in the shadows of nuclear threats and locked under the weight of medieval ideologies. What you're about to hear might challenge what you think you know. We're going to break down the legal and strategic logic of how the U.S. took on the role of the lone sentinel, defending the baseline of global security and trying to break the chains for millions of silenced people. These were ultimate choices that the world often misunderstood, but from a certain perspective were absolutely necessary. The Shuster Mission, 1911. Many people conveniently skip over the year 1911 when discussing U.S. Iran relations. But in Washington's eyes, that year represented the purest act of American idealism on the global stage. At the time, the U.S. sent financial expert Morgan Shuster to Tehran. Remember, Shuster didn't arrive with cannons or warships. He arrived with accounting ledgers and a blueprint for modern administrative auditing. In an era when Iran was being strangled by British and Russian colonial debt, America was the only outsider seeking no territory, only to help Iran reclaim its financial sovereignty. Here are 3 hard-hitting facts you need to know. First, he dared to break the chains of debt. The moment Shuster took office, he made a bold stand. Iran's tax revenue belonged in Iran's treasury, not in the pockets of foreign powers for unfair debts. To him, without financial independence, sovereignty was just a fairy tale. Second, he built the Treasury Gendarmerie. To give Iran a backbone, Shuster established a professional tax police force. When pro-Russian elites refused to pay their taxes, he didn't blink. He ordered their assets seized. He was teaching an ancient civilization a modern lesson, that no one is above the law, and that rules mean nothing without enforcement. Third, he openly defied the great power games. Shuster completely ignored the secret deals between Britain and Russia to carve up Iran. He insisted that his contract was with the elected Iranian parliament, not foreign emperors. This fierce defense of the sanctity of contracts terrified European powers who were used to gunboat diplomacy. We all know how it ended. In the winter of 1911, Tsarist Russia issued an ultimatum: expel Shuster, or we level Tehran. To save Iran from total war, Shuster resigned in tears. While European powers were still using opium and predatory loans to extort the world, America was offering the seeds of a modern government. Shuster failed, but it wasn't a failure of American values. His book, The Strangling of Persia, remains a haunting indictment of that dirty colonial era. In those dark years, the U.S. was the only civilizational mentor willing to use law and logic to help Iran keep its soul. Shuster's departure wasn't just a personal exit. It was the moment the sparks of a Persian rebirth were crushed by colonial violence. 1953, the strategic necessity. When we fast forward to 1953, many people get bogged down in the tactics of the coup. But inside the Washington strategy rooms, they weren't looking at local unrest. They were looking at the survival of the entire free world. You have to understand the context. This was the peak of the Cold War, its darkest hour. The Soviet shadow was stretching southward, hungry to turn Iran into just another red satellite state. So why did the U.S. feel it had to step in? First, the Mossadegh regime was drifting into a lethal gray zone. In his drive to nationalize oil, he began aligning with the Soviet-backed Tudeh Party. To Washington, this wasn't just a business dispute. It was a flashing red light. If Iran fell, the world's energy lifeline would end up in the hands of the Kremlin. If the Soviets controlled the Persian Gulf, the industrial heartbeat of Western civilization could be stopped at any moment. The internal logic was crystal clear. Under the shadow of nuclear war, there was no room for error. If the U.S. stood by and did nothing, Iran risked becoming the next North Korea or another piece of the Eastern Bloc. To prevent World War III and halt the spread of communism in the Middle East, the U.S. had to support a stable, pro-Western government. This wasn't about stealing oil. It was about global rebalancing. For the United States at that time, keeping the Middle East from turning red was the only way to keep the path to global freedom open. While history often labels this as interference, at that specific turning point, it was seen as the ultimate defense, a heavy burden carried by the leader of the free world to protect a much larger order. The Great Experiment and the White Revolution. Over the next 20 years, the United States poured everything into Iran's modernization. In Washington's eyes, this wasn't just about supporting an ally. It was a grand civilizational experiment. America set out to take a nation shackled by medieval tradition and feudalism and transform it into a modern, secular society. To understand the scale of this mission, you have to realize what the old Iran actually looked like before these changes. First, there was the systemic oppression of women. Under the old feudal codes, Iranian women had almost no legal identity. They were denied education, hidden behind heavy veils, and stripped of the right to vote. It was a suffocating erasure of the potential of half the population. Second, there was the brutal grip of the landlords. The countryside was controlled by a handful of feudal lords who acted like medieval masters. They didn't just own the land, they owned the lives of the peasants who worked it. Families were trapped in a cycle of crushing debt and poverty that lasted for generations. To break this cycle of darkness, the U.S. threw its full weight behind the Shah's White Revolution. The Shah launched aggressive land reforms, seizing territory from greedy landlords and giving it back to the millions of farmers who actually tilled the soil. We championed the right of women to vote and to be educated. Suddenly, thousands of Iranian women were casting off the black robes and stepping into universities, careers, and independence. This was the peak of American idealism in action. During this golden age, Tehran became known as the Paris of the Middle East. It wasn't just about the new skyscrapers. It was about a culture that was becoming secular, free, and forward-looking. At that time, Americans truly believed they were opening a window to civilization that had been boarded up for 1,000 years. 1979, the Civilizational Collapse. However, in the eyes of Washington, the chaos that erupted in 1979 wasn't a revolution. It was a catastrophic civilizational regression. That year, radicals stormed the U.S. Embassy, taking 52 diplomats hostage for 444 agonizing days. You have to understand, in international law, this is the ultimate red line. Even in the heat of total war, diplomatic immunity is the final consensus of a civilized world. When the Iranian regime chose to trample over that consensus, America realized it was no longer dealing with a normal political entity. We were facing a radical theocratic anomaly, an opponent that refuses to play by the rules or respect the conventions of human civilization is the single most dangerous threat to global stability. Internally, this regime became the strangler of progress. The very first thing they did upon taking power was to strip away the freedom of women. The same women who had entered universities and the workforce during the White Revolution were forced back into heavy black veils. The law retreated 1,000 years, and a vibrant modern society was suddenly smothered by a suffocating, feudal, high-pressure system. America could not simply stand by and watch an awakened nation be dragged back into the Dark Ages. Externally, the regime became a global arsonist. They weren't content with just ruling Iran. They openly declared their intent to export the revolution. Using money and weapons, they began fueling proxies and inciting unrest across the entire Middle East. In Washington's view, if we didn't stand up to contain it, this purple flame of radicalism would consume the Persian Gulf and destroy the security order established after World War II. This wasn't just a spat between two countries. This was a life and death struggle between modern civilization and the remnants of the Middle Ages. America had to step up. Because if the rules can be trampled with impunity, the world will return to a wilderness where only the strongest survive. The Nuclear Firewall. Now we arrive at the very heart of the U.S. Iran standoff, the ultimate red line, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT. People often ask, who gave America the right to have nukes while Iran can't? Isn't that just pure hegemony? If you look at it from the perspective of human survival, the answer is clear. This isn't hegemony. It's the final firewall of civilization. In 1968, the world realized that if nuclear technology spread without restraint, this planet would eventually go up in flames due to a single miscalculation. The NPT was born, not just as a treaty, but as a survival pact for the human race. It defines the peaceful use of energy and, more importantly, prevents nuclear weapons from becoming cheap chips in a geopolitical game. So, why is Washington so unyielding when it comes to Iran crossing this line? First, the terrifying domino effect. The Middle East is a global powder keg of complex religious and sectarian tensions. If Iran goes nuclear, countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey will feel they have no choice but to start their own nuclear programs. Pause for emphasis. Imagine the most unstable region on Earth bristling with nuclear warheads. A single border skirmish could trigger a global nuclear holocaust. By stopping Iran, America is preventing the Middle East from becoming a fuse that blows up the entire world. Second, the risk of irrational decision-making. Traditional nuclear deterrence works because both sides prioritize survival. But when the nuclear button is held by a theocracy that glorifies martyrdom and openly calls for the erasure of other nations, the logic of balance fails. Rhetorical tone. Can we really bet the future of human civilization on a regime that operates on a logic of final judgment rather than modern rules? The hard truth is that not every nation should have nuclear weapons. Nuclear power isn't just strength, it's a crushing moral burden. Only nations that have proven they can follow international order, remain predictable, and operate on rational logic are fit to handle such destructive power. In this struggle, the United States isn't acting as a bully. It's acting as the sentinel of global order. We apply maximum pressure and even risk the brink of conflict because we must defend the sanctity of that nuclear order. For Washington, if we back down on non-proliferation today, tomorrow we will wake up in a world of ruins under the shadow of a nuclear fireball. 2026, the final chapter and the heavy burden. Now, in 2026, this conflict isn't just a sudden explosion. It is the inevitable endgame of a century-long struggle. First, we are finally cutting the fuse on a global nuclear bomb. For years, diplomacy has led to dead ends, and sanctions have been pushed to their absolute limits, yet the centrifuges kept spinning. Washington knows that it is far better to disarm a threat to civilization now than to pick through the radioactive ruins of a world that waited too long. Second, we are removing a systemic cancer that feeds on global chaos. When a regime prioritizes arming proxies over feeding its own people, when it exports radicalism to tear down global stability, it forfeits its seat at the table of peaceful nations. Americans have always understood one harsh truth. Peace is not free. If we choose the comfort of appeasement today, the world of tomorrow will pay a price that no one can afford. The destiny of a superpower. Looking back at this 100-year saga, it's clear that as the primary defender of global order, the United States is destined to be misunderstood and even vilified. But history will be the ultimate judge. When feudal theocracy tried to strangle the human spirit and the longing for freedom, it was America that pushed back. When an out-of-control nuclear ambition threatened to trigger a doomsday race in the Middle East, it was America that held the line. The fire we see today is the final collision between two opposing civilizational logics. We aren't blindly choosing war. We are choosing to end a half-century of systemic errors. We are doing this for the survival of civilization, ensuring the next generation never has to live under the shadow of theocratic oppression or a nuclear cloud. We aren't just defending American interests. We are defending the very foundations of the modern world, a world built on rules, on law, and on reason. I've always believed in a simple truth. With great power comes great responsibility. And today, fulfilling that responsibility is the only path toward a lasting peace. All right, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.